Resident Evil is full of monsters and creatures of just about every shape, form, and size throughout the entire franchise, so it shouldn't be too shocking when the game gives you some pretty intense weapons to take down some of the big bads of the series. And considering how big some of the monsters can get, clearly you're going to need the most powerful weapon that you can get your hands on when dealing with some of these creatures. Which is exactly what we are going to be focusing on with today's episode of Nerdspace Games. I'll be diving into every Resident Evil game as I locate some of the most intense and overpowered weapons of the franchise as I give you guys the top 10 most powerful weapons of the series. Before we get started, as always, let's lay some ground rules. First off, I'll only be including weapons that are specifically used by the player at some point. Also, I'm only looking at the video games. And yes, I will be including bonus weapons on this list as well. Finally, ranking today's list is a bit subjective, but basically I'm going to be looking at what the weapons do, what the weapon accomplishes, the pros and cons of each of the weapons on today's list, and how destructive the weapon is overall. What that means is that this list isn't about the best weapon, but rather the most powerful weapon of the series. Okay, with probably the longest intro out of the way, my name is Ruben with Nerdspace Games, and this is the top 10 most powerful weapons in Resident Evil. Let's get it. Number 10, Minigun, Gatling Gun, multiple games. If you're looking for something automatic, miniguns in Resident Evil are pretty overpowered. As it only appears in certain Resident Evil titles, a minigun in this franchise can make quick work of any and all enemies. One game we see it in is Resident Evil 5, in which it's an unlockable bonus weapon for Chris Redfield. This weapon is so powerful that you could literally clear out a horde of Magini within seconds. Taking a look at Resident Evil 2 Remake, you'll find yet another minigun. This one is first seen as an in-game weapon in Claire's scenario, in which you'll have to use this bad boy to put Birkin down. Again, high damage, high speed, what's not to like here? This minigun will wipe out Birkin on its own if you manage to hit his weak spot with as many shots as possible, despite him being a bullet sponge. In fact, if you're really lucky, you might have some bullets left over for final stage Birkin if you're playing as Claire in the second run. You can also unlock this weapon as a bonus weapon, in which you'll be able to completely destroy zombies, lickers, and even Mr. X each time you encounter him. The only real downside to this weapon in any of the games that it appears in is the weight of the weapon. Because it's so big, this weapon will slow down the player dramatically, making it that much more difficult to avoid attacks from quicker enemies. To be honest with you, most people probably prefer the Chicago typewriter because of its mobility and how fast it can mow down enemies, but since today's list is about the most powerful weapons instead of the best weapons, I went with the minigun for this list instead. Number 9, Magnums, multiple games. Kind of cheating here, but I'm combining every single Magnum into a single entry on today's list. When it comes to Resident Evil games, usually the most powerful weapon outside of the bonus weapons or the one-off in-game weapons are the Magnums. In the early games, Magnums usually instantly kill most of the regular enemies throughout the game, like hunters, lickers, and zombies. The latter of course being the most satisfying thanks to the popping head effect. Love that feeling, by the way. In fact, there's examples of Magnums killing in-game bosses of the franchise with a single shot. Just look at Resident Evil 0. Anyway, I really couldn't pick which Magnum I wanted to feature on here, as there's too many in the franchise to the point where they can take up a whole video on its own. In fact, keep an eye out for that list. Just to name a few though, you have the Lightning Hawk. That's the Magnum seen in multiple games, with my favorite version of it being Resident Evil 5. While the damage of it isn't as powerful as other Magnums of the franchise, the Lightning Hawk makes up for it with its piercing effect. Essentially, you can take down 2 enemies with a single shot from this weapon, as the bullet will go through the first enemy and into the second enemy. The Elephant Killer in Resident Evil 6 is another fantastic Magnum. The Railgun in Resident Evil 3 Remake is another great one, even though it doesn't exactly work like a traditional Magnum. While it's labeled as one, the Railgun mainly shines in the fact that it will literally destroy enemies when hitting their weak spots. However, if we're talking about my personal favorite Magnum, of course that has to go to the Colt Anaconda, aka Barry Silver Serpent. This weapon is badass in the way it looks as well as how powerful it is. Just to give you an idea of how strong this weapon can be, try using it on the Stage 1 Tyrant in Resident Evil 1 Remake. It'll kill the dude in a single shot. Of course, the only way to get this weapon is by letting Barry die in jail scenario, but you know what, I think it's a fair trade-off. Sorry Barry Burton fans. Number 8, LZ Answerer, Resident Evil Village. If you ever wanted to see Star Wars meets Resident Evil, then look no farther than the LZ Answerer, aka a fucking lightsaber. Yeah, this weapon is basically the iconic Jedi laser sword itself, as it allows Ethan Winters to go full force on these werewolves. See what I did there? Obviously the weapon doesn't really compare to the other bonus weapons of the game when it comes to what's the most useful, but when you look at the full package for this saber, it's pretty damn powerful. As I already said, the LZ Answerer is basically a lightsaber in which you could go single blade or double blade. On top of changing the type of lightsaber, you could also change the color, of which it also comes with a unique ability for each color. Again, it's not the most useful or impressive weapon, but between its abilities and the fact that it's a fucking lightsaber, yeah, this weapon definitely deserves a spot on today's list. Number 7, Albert-01, Resident Evil 7. How do you make a handgun one of the most powerful weapons in a Resident Evil game? Give it the power of a Magnum while still allowing it to use handgun ammo. That, my friend, is one devastating combination. In Resident Evil 7, you actually don't get to see this weapon until the end of the game. After the first stage fight against Evelyn, Chris Redfield shows up and tosses Ethan the Albert-01 and tells him to use it against Evelyn. At first glance, you're probably like, okay, this is just a handgun or a Magnum. Where's the in-game rocket launcher that's seen in most Resident Evil games? That's until you fire a couple of shots into Evelyn, and shockingly, it's enough to put her down for good. Didn't expect that, now did you? After beating the game though, you unlock Albert-01 as a bonus weapon. While not as useful as the circular saw, the Albert-01R is extremely beneficial thanks to the fact that you can use it with handgun bullets while also dealing high damage attacks that match that of traditional Magnums. However, the big reason why this gun earns itself a spot on today's list comes from the fact that it was used to take down one of the biggest monsters of the entire franchise in the form of Final Stage Evelyn. Number 6, Grenade Launcher, multiple games. Grenade launchers have and always will be one of the more powerful and most useful weapons of Resident Evil. Ever since the original game, the grenade launcher became one of the most versatile weapons of the series. That's due to the fact that the grenade launcher featured different types of ammo that were useful for different enemy types. Explosive, aka traditional rounds, deal heavy damage and were great for crowd control. Acid rounds deal the most damage on certain types of enemies. Flame rounds will light enemies on fire while also dealing critical damage towards enemies weak to fire. In later games, the grenade launcher continues to become even more OP and useful for different situations. For example, in Resident Evil 5, you get flash rounds for it, which allows you to instantly take out any parasite type enemies while stunning other enemies in the area. In Resident Evil 3 and even RE7, you have freeze rounds, which works perfectly for slowing down enemies and giving yourself a chance at dealing critical hits on nearby enemies. And then of course, going back to Resident Evil 5, you have electric rounds, which paralyze enemies in the area. Overall, the grenade launchers in Resident Evil are both explosive and versatile, therefore it's easily one of the more powerful weapons of the series. Number 5, L.T.D, Resident Evil 5. So I know I'm technically cheating here by putting the L.T.D from Resident Evil 5 in the number 5 spot, but listen, I know technically this weapon is less of a weapon and more of a target locator for a satellite, but I believe since you have full control on how that satellite is used, it's close enough. Anyway, in Resident Evil 5, you come across Excella's monster form, Ahiri. If you saw a different video of mine, then you would know that Ahiri is one of the largest monsters of the Resident Evil franchise. So obviously, you're going to need a massive weapon to put her down. Enter the L.T.D. Visually, it looks like the linear launcher from Code Veronica, but it's more similar to the Hammer of Dawn from the Gears of War franchise. The L.T.D is used to target a weak spot on Ahiri, and then after charging it up for a brief moment, it'll activate a satellite laser to come crashing down on her, completely destroying her weak spot. Because of how powerful the weapon is and the fact that it's used to bring down one of the biggest enemies of the franchise, L.T.D definitely earns itself a high spot on today's list. Also, while we're on the topic, honorable mention to the laser pointer in Resident Evil Village that acts in a similar way to take down the Megamycete barrier, a horde of Lycans, and a giant werewolf with a warhammer. Number 4, Linear Launcher, Resident Evil Code Veronica. The linear launcher is one of the most unique weapons of classic Resident Evil games, as you have to aim in first person to use the weapon. Now this weapon is both a bonus weapon and an in-game weapon that's used to kill Alexia Ashford at the end of the game. This weapon was actually designed by Alexia's father, Alexander Ashford, in order to kill Alexia in case she got too close to her dream of world domination. Essentially, this weapon is as powerful as the traditional rocket launchers seen throughout the franchise. However, it has some additional benefits. For one, it's an energy blast that shoots much faster than your traditional rocket launcher. However, unlike most versions of the rocket launcher, unless you get the infinite version of it as a bonus weapon, the linear launcher has unlimited ammo from the get-go, even in the endgame fight against the final stage of Alexia Ashford. Now, the only issue that I have with ranking this weapon higher than the rocket launcher comes from one main issue. The linear launcher has only proven itself against the enemies of one Resident Evil game, whereas the rocket launchers of the series has proven itself time and time again as a weapon that instantly kills most monsters of the series. There's actually very few bosses of the franchise that's not killed with a rocket launcher, or maybe only like 3 or 4 monsters of the series that's not killed with a single shot from the rocket launcher, but 2 instead. So while it appears to be just as destructive as rocket launchers are within the series, we have to rank it under it, unfortunately. Number 3, P.R.L. 412, Resident Evil 4. Speaking of lasers, how about a weapon that literally sends a laser blast that completely eliminates any and all parasites in its way? Enter the P.R.L. 412. As I said, this is basically a laser gun that has 2 different attacks: a quick flash attack and a fully charged laser beam. The flash attack is used by shooting the weapon without fully charging it. This will act as a flash grenade almost, but it'll also deal damage to nearby enemies. This is extremely beneficial when surrounded by ganados or when parasite monsters are nearby. However, the more devastating attack is the fully charged laser beam. This attack can literally kill almost any enemy, including bosses, in a single shot. Considering that this laser has the same impact as a rocket launcher, unlimited ammo, and a quick fire ability, all while being a fairly small weapon compared to other entries on this list, the PR412 is without a doubt the 3rd most powerful weapon of the Resident Evil franchise. Number 2, rocket launcher, multiple games. Clearly, the rocket launchers has to be on this list for most powerful weapons of the franchise. I mean, story-wise, how many bosses have been killed by a rocket launcher thrown to you from a different character? The Tyrant in Resident Evil, Mr. X in Resident Evil 2, Sadler in Resident Evil 4, Albert Wesker via 2 rockets in Resident Evil 5, and even Alex Wesker in Resident Evil Revelations 2. The list is massive in terms of how many villains of Resident Evil were killed by a rocket launcher in some way. With that in mind, the weapon is already more destructive than most weapons of the franchise just from a story point of view. Then, from a gameplay point of view, rocket launchers are usually viewed as the most powerful bonus weapons of their respective games. Clearly, rocket launchers in most Resident Evil games are instant kills for just about every enemy of each game. This is why most games feature an infinite rocket launcher as a bonus weapon. However, some games like Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 4 feature rocket launchers that can be found and even purchased as well. These launchers only have 1 shot, but this 1 shot will still instantly kill most bosses of the game with a few exceptions. Considering the weapon is basically an instant kill attack while also being vital to most endings of the franchise in terms of the story, this weapon easily claims the number 2 spot over other powerful weapons like the linear launcher and the PR412. There's only one weapon that in my opinion is more powerful than the rocket launcher. Number 1, Railgun, Resident Evil 3. The most powerful weapon of Resident Evil is the Railgun. Now listen, I know this might be a controversial pick as it only appears in a single Resident Evil game, whereas the rocket launcher appears in multiple games. However, the Railgun was able to prove that it's way more destructive than any other weapon of the series in the one game that it appeared in, mainly because of how it's used in Resident Evil 3. As you would expect, the Railgun is the in-game weapon that's used to kill the final boss of the game, Nemesis. But that's exactly why this weapon is so powerful, because it's the weapon that basically ends Nemesis once and for all. Let's rewind a bit and look at why this is such a big deal. Throughout Resident Evil 3 and its remake, Nemesis has been taken down briefly in multiple ways. He's run over by a car in which it explodes on him. He's shot with a rocket launcher by Carlos, you know, the 2nd most powerful weapon on today's list. He has a ton of acid poured on top of him while also being electrified multiple times during that same fight. This guy is literally indestructible. Well, almost. As it turns out, there's only one weapon that was able to put Nemesis down for good. Not only is this the most powerful weapon, but this gun has to be charged by massive batteries, and it's a weapon that's bigger than Jill Valentine herself. With all of this evidence, the Railgun, despite only showing up in a single game, is without a doubt the most powerful weapon of Resident Evil. No exceptions. But that's it for this episode of Nerd Space Games. Hit up the comments and let me know what you think of my list. Is the Railgun in Resident Evil 3 the most powerful weapon of the entire franchise, or is there a different weapon that deserves that title? Also, are there any powerful weapons I forgot about that you think I should have included with this list? Let me know down below. Anyway, if you haven't already, be sure to subscribe to my channel for more survival horror content. Also, leave a like on today's video if you enjoyed today's topic. But thanks for watching, and as always, I'll catch you guys on the next episode of Nerd Space Games. Take care.